Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in sophomore English. We turn now in our textbook to unit number 6, starting on 1045. This is our final unit in our study of sophomore English. Themes in literature, heroes and dreamers. That's the topic. The question, the big question is, can anyone be a hero? I'm on page 1046 with you. Let's just work through, as we have done all of our previous units, to just make sure that we're all on board with the focus. Notice we've got some vocabulary words for us on 1047. We're going to begin with elements of the oral tradition on 1048. I'm not going to read all of this with you, but I want to make sure that you have certain pieces of information bullet pointed starting on 1048. The oral tradition, long before the invention of writing in books, singers and storytellers recited the tales and lore of their cultures. Passed from one generation to the next, the poems and stories they told are referred to as the oral tradition. Of course, the most famous oral tradition story in the West is the stories of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, no doubt. And then in the English tradition, the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf that we'll study as seniors. Of course, we're going to have the same expression of themes, cultural experiences, universal themes. Hey, do you see that word archetypes? Archetypes on page 1048. Make sure that's in your notes. Archetypes often used in the telling of their tales. Characters, situations, images, symbols that reoccur in the narratives of all cultures. We have a chart here that kind of gives us, examples of the archetypical characters: wise and virtuous rulers, dreamers or transgressors, the hero. The archetypal patterns, the struggle between the protagonist and the antagonist, a series of tests come to mind, right? All right, and storytellers in the oral tradition explore these universal themes, insights into life that reoccur throughout world literature, often developing these themes using these archetypes, right? Patterns. You might write it down as patterns. Forms and characteristics of the oral tradition. Point of view always matters for us. Attitudes and beliefs about the world. We have narrative forms in the oral tradition. See that box on 1049. We have myths. We have folk tales. We have legends. We have fairy tales. And then, of course, we have epics that we're familiar with. We're reviewing, obviously, from our freshman year as well, again, some of these ideas. The theme, and analyzing the theme of 1050 is obviously huge, right? We're going to look at literary elements like characters, setting, plot, conflict, archetypes. We're going to look at point of view. The point of view or perspective consists of the author's thoughts and attitudes about a subject or topic, right? Notice we're going to have some development of the theme throughout these texts. Theme and cultural experience is going to matter for us on 1051. Especially because so many of these texts come from cultures that you are not necessarily directly familiar with. And that's what makes studying in unit number 6 so much fun. Universally and culturally specific themes, universal themes and culturally specific themes that reflect the particular circumstances and beliefs of the author's culture, right? And they give you some examples of this. Shifting points of view. Do you see that on page 1051? We will see this as well. Stories passed down through the oral tradition, story details changed as the point of view of the authors changed, right? And they give you some examples from Snow White itself. Theme and point of view in nonfiction, like works in the oral tradition, modern fiction expresses themes. In addition, some literary nonfiction may be said to have themes. For example, a writer may tell the true stories of friendship that illustrate the central idea or theme that our friends know us better than we know ourselves, right? Literary nonfiction may also present an author's point of view explicitly, as when the author argues a position, or implicitly, as when a true story suggests an author's beliefs and attitudes. Now, as has been the case in our previous units, we're going to turn to a close reading. We're going to start on page 1052 with our clues to theme, setting, characters, cultural context, point of view, conflict and plot, statements and observations, archetypical elements in your chart there. And notice again they're colored, right, with different colors, which will allow us now in our brief cutting from Achebe's Things Fall Apart study to be able to pay attention. So while we read this together, we're going to be moving between the text and the box information there on the right at 1053. Let's begin with the model. Britain began its official colonization of Nigeria in 1861, and it was only in 1960 that Nigeria achieved independence. Nigerian author Chinua Achebe grew up under British control, British colonial rule. In his famous novel, Things Fall Apart, by the way, you'll remember this writer from Civil Peace. We did an earlier cutting of his. In 1958, Things Fall Apart. That's the title you want in your notes, so make sure you have it. Achebe depicts the tragic consequences of British colonialism for traditional Igbo tribal culture. This excerpt is from chapter 1 of the book, Things Fall Apart. Let's just read it now together. And as we read, let's pay attention again to the way that your textbook is guiding us through this model study. Oikoyo was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond. His fame rested on solid personal achievements. As a young man of 18, he had brought honor to his village by throwing Amilza the cat. Amilza was the great wrestler who for 7 years was unbeaten. From Euphemia to Mbina, he was called the cat because his back would never touch the earth. It was this man that Oikoyo threw in a fight. By the way, just pause. Notice, we're dealing now with characters. Oikoyo is the archetypical hero, admired by his people for his strength and deeds. However, his fierceness and refusal to display weakness will prove to be his tragic flaw. Okoyo's behavior and attitudes are keys to universal themes of status and self-worth. To continue, by the way, we're working now with the archetypical elements in number 5. It was this man that Oikoyo threw in a fight, which the old men agreed was one of the fiercest since the founder of their town engaged in the spirit of the wild for 7 days and 7 nights. Again, the archetypical elements. The elders compare Oikoyo's fight to a flight in a legend. The founding of a village or a city by a hero who vanquishes a monster is an archetypical plot pattern, as in the notion of a battle that lasts for days. The drums beat. I'm back to the reading now. The drums beat, and the flutes sang, and the spectators held their breath. Amilza was a wily craftsman, but Oikoyo was as slippery as a fish in water. Every nerve, every muscle stood out on their arms, on their backs and their thighs, and one almost heard them stretching to breaking point. In the end, Oikoyo threw the cat. That was many years ago, 20 years or more. And during this time, Okoyo's fame had grown like a brush fire in the Hamatan. He was tall and huge, and his bushy eyebrows and wide nose gave him a very serene look. He breathed heavily, and it was said that when he slept, his wives and children in their houses could hear him breathe. When he walked, his heels hardly touched the ground, and he seemed to walk on springs as if he was going to pounce on somebody. And he did pounce on people quite often. He had a slight stammer, and whenever he was angry, he could not get his words out quickly enough. He would use his fists. He had no patience with unsuccessful men. He had no patience with his father. Now, notice at number 6, the statements and observations. The narrator contrasts Okoyo's aggressive behavior with his father's laziness. These statements reveal one of the novel's culturally specific themes, the importance of status and ambition among the Igbo people. Just to continue this at number 6 with statements and observations. Unko, for that was his father's name, had died 10 years ago. In his day, he was lazy and improvident and was quite incapable of thinking about tomorrow. If any money came his way, and it seldom did, he immediately bought gourds of palm wine, called round his neighbors, and made merry. He always said that whenever he saw a dead man's mouth, I'm on page 1054 now, whenever he saw a dead man's mouth, he saw the folly of not eating what one had in one's lifetime. Unko was, of course, a debtor, and he owed every neighbor some money, from a few cowries to quite substantial amounts. He was tall but very thin and had a slight stoop. He wore a haggard and mournful look. Notice we're now comparing the differences between father and son. Mournful look, except when he was drinking or playing on his flute. He was very good on his flute, and his happiest moments were the 2 or 3 moons after the harvest, when the village musicians brought down their instruments hung above the fireplace. And now we're going to get to number 7, cultural context and point of view. Achebe wrote this novel to present Igbo society in all its complexity. He also wished to counter European stereotypes of Africans as, quote-unquote, primitive people. The details in this passage, the customs and traditions of the Igbo, their fellowship and appreciation of music, food, and nature, reveal Achebe's point of view as well as the cultural experience that shapes his themes. We'll keep reading. Unkoyo would play with him, his face beaming with blessedness and peace. Sometimes another village would ask Unkoyo's band and their dancing agui to come and stay with them and teach them their tunes. They would go to such hosts for as long as 3 or 4 markets, making music and feasting. Unkoyo loved the good fare, the good fellowship, and he loved the season of the year when the rains had stopped and the sun rose every morning with dazzling beauty. And it was not too hot either, because the cold and dry Hatnan wind was blowing down from the north. Some years the Hatnan was very severe, and a dense haze hung on the atmosphere. Old men and children would then sit round log fires warming their bodies. Unkoyo loved it all, and he loved the first kites that returned with the dry season, and the children who sang songs of welcome to them. He would remember his own childhood now, how he had often wandered around looking for a kite sailing leisurely against the blue sky. As soon as he found one, he would sing with his whole being, welcoming it back from its long, long journey and asking if it had brought home any lengths of cloth. Of course, kite here is birds of prey, right? The next one is the characters at number 8. Okoye's weaknesses are directly described by the narrator, notice. Achebe is setting up a further contrast between the father and the son that's coming. That was years ago when he was young. Okoye, the grown-up, was a failure. He was poor, and his wife and his children had barely enough to eat. People laughed at him because he was a loafer, and they swore never to lend him any more money because he never paid back. But Okoye was such a man that he always succeeded in borrowing more and piling up his debts. One day, a neighbor called Okoye came in to see him. He was reclining on a mud bed in his hut playing on the flute. He immediately rose and shook hands with Okoye, who then unrolled the goatskin which he had carried under his arm and sat down. Okoye went into an inner room and soon returned with a small wooden disc containing the cola nut, some alligator pepper, and a lump of white chalk. "I have cola," he answered when he sat down and passed the disc over to his guest. By the way, in our freshman year, you remember in our study of the Odyssey, we call this xenia, right? That hospitality. And it's worldwide in its understanding. You are supposed to show proper hospitality when somebody comes to visit. I'm on 1055. "Thank you. He who brings cola brings life. But I think you ought to break it," replied Okoye, passing back the disc. "No, it is for you, I think." And they argued like this for a few moments before Okoye accepted the honor of breaking the cola. Okoye, meanwhile, took the lump of chalk, drew some lines on the floor, and then painted his big toe. As he broke the cola, Okoye prayed to their ancestors for life and health and for protection against their enemies. When they had eaten, they talked about many things, about the heavy rains which were drowning the yams, about the next ancestral feast, and about the impending war with the village of Mobina. Okoye was never happy when it came to wars. He was in fact a coward and could not bear the sight of blood. Now we're going to get at number 9. Notice on 1055, point of view. Okoye's thoughts about music hint at Achebe's point of view. There is sorrow and grief as well as joy in tribal life. And he changed the subject and talked about music, and his face beamed. He could hear in his mind's ear the blood-stirring and intricate rhythms of the Ike and the Udu and the Orji. And he could hear his own flute weaving in and out of them, decorating them with a colorful and plaintive tune. The total effect was gay and brisk, but if one picked out the flute as it went up and down, and then broke up into short snatches, one saw that there was sorrow and grief there. Next we'll get number 10, to conflict. See our box? Here Achebe begins to set up yet another contrast. Okoye is everything that Akua is not. Okoye is successful and wealthy, whereas Akuna is regarded as a failure. This passage hints at conflict to come between Nkoa and Okoye. Okoye was also a musician. He played on the ojin, but he was not a failure like Nkoa. He had a large barn full of yams. He had 3 wives. And now he was going to take the Adimi title, the 3rd highest in the land. It was a very expensive ceremony, and he was gathering all his resources together. That was, in fact, the reason why he had come to see Okoye. He cleared his throat and began, "Thank you for the cola. You may have heard of the title I intend to take shortly." Having spoken plainly so far, Okoye has said that the next half a dozen sentences in Proverbs. Among the Igbo, the art of conversation is regarded very highly, and Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. Okoye was a great talker, and he spoke for a long time, skirting around the subject and then hinting at it finally. In short, he was asking Okoye to return the 200 cowries he had borrowed from him more than 2 years before. As soon as Okoye understood what his friend was driving at, he burst out laughing. He laughed loud and long, and his voice rang out clear as the ojin, and tears stood in his eyes. His visitor was amazed and stood speechless. Notice at number 11 at the bottom of the page there in theme, in the contrast between Okoye and his father, between the father and Okoye, Achebe introduces themes of status and ambition. In his descriptions of Igbo culture, he introduces the theme of tradition. By comparing Okoye to folklore heroes, he ensures that the reader will see in Okoye's story a message about the fate of traditional ways. And let's jump to 2A really quickly. Obviously, this is one of the central ideas in not just our cutting, but in the novel itself of Things Fall Apart. By the way, Things Fall Apart is a line from a poem that you and I will study together in our senior year by W.B. Yeats called Second Coming. So write that down at 3A, Second Coming, where Yeats, predicting the future of the 20th century, will talk about how things fall apart, the center cannot hold. It's an idea of political chaos is coming. And of course, that's one of the major messages here, so let's write that down. Change seems to be inevitable because of technologies. And as change happens and occurs, individuals who are affected by that change, sometimes in very negative ways, sometimes in positive ways, but a lot of times in negative ways, especially in cultures that are very traditional, because things change and the traditions obviously change. We can go back to our cutting from Raisin in the Sun at 3A and make that observation. At 2B, obviously we've got all kinds of things going on here. Characterization, point of view, cultural context and point of view, all of those has been significant in our study here at this text. Finally, at 3A, what for you is the text that demonstrates that loss of traditions in a culture? That maybe things have gone away and technology has brought about that radical change. Of course, we can go back to a title like By the Waters of Babylon that we studied earlier, in that apocalyptic kind of text, to take a look at the ways things change maybe after great catastrophe. Anthem comes to mind, Ayn Rand's novel as well, doesn't it? Finally, at 3B, in your own family culture, what do you recognize is a tradition that has already changed? It's already changed. So, for example, people in your family will talk about it, but you can recognize it's not the same. It's not like it once was anymore. Things have gone on, maybe moved on. And then finally, what is a tradition in your family that is maybe something that's held on to, right, in your culture, in your family? By the way, just jump back to 3B really quickly, since we were working with some of those apocalyptic texts. We can work with Ray Bradbury. So, for example, think about his There Will Come Soft Rains, as well as Fahrenheit 451. Those texts that picture what happens in the future because technology is being produced today. But within your own family, what is a tradition that you hope still you hold on to? And maybe even if someday you are a parent of children, you will try to hold on to that tradition or to that way of seeing things. Well, there you go. I hope that your reading here will interest you in picking up the entire novel of Things Fall Apart, Achebe's novel, and read it. Thank you.